The Untold Radio Network fans want exclusive perks and to support our channel. Introducing our YouTube membership program with 3 amazing levels. Get loyalty badges that level up to different cryptids the longer you're a supporter. How cool is that? You'll also get access to custom Bigfoot emojis and priority in chat. Upgrade to Backstage Pass for exclusive wallpapers, photos, status updates, discounted books, and merchandise. Go all in with the producer level for everything mentioned plus member shoutouts. Ready for an enhanced experience? Join now, pick your membership level, and let's make this journey even more exciting together.
The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your host, Dr. Dean Bertram.
Well, greetings to all my fellow weirdos and weirdettes. Welcome to Talking Weird on the Untold Radio Network. I'm your host, Dean Bertram, and I'm delighted that you're joining me, whether live on Saturday night and watching the live stream or listening later on your podcast platform of choice. I'll get right into it tonight. I'm really excited. I've got one of my best friends in the world joining me. He's a longtime fan of history, both the kind they teach in school and the history they want kept hidden. He lives in a 115-year-old haunted house in Racine, Wisconsin with his wife, Barb, 4 Alaskan Malamutes, and a cat that controls his life. He's the producer of the film Milwaukee Mafia, Frank BALISTRIERI, and he's also the co-author of several books, including UFO Cults, Watch the Sky. So I'm delighted to welcome back to Talking Weird to chat about the recent Mexican mummified alien story, as well as other strange dead alien stories throughout history. My very good friend, the one and only Mr. Wayne Clingman.
Oh, how are you guys doing tonight?
It's great to have you here, mate.
Great to be here, sir. It's a pleasure and honor. Thank you so much.
You're being beaten by storms down in Racine, though, you were telling me.
We are indeed, but it rains. We need the water badly, so we'll take it. Better rain than snow. I don't have to shovel it.
Well, that won't be too long till we'll both be shoveling, both of us being in Wisconsin and all. I'm going to feel bad if your computer blows up because you were going to use your phone, and I'm like, plug your computer back in, it will be better. And you're like, well, if the lightning takes me out.
Okay. I have faith.
Well, what a strange week. So we had just a couple months ago the UFO congressional hearings here, which I talked about at some length, both on Talking Weird and Mysterious Library, as well as a few other shows I guested on. And now, not to be one-upped, the Mexican government decided to do their own UFO congressional hearings. And while it wasn't only about dead alien bodies, that's certainly what became front and center of the various news agencies around the world. The revelation by Jamie Mawson, who's a relatively well-known UFO personality and journalist in Mexico, of these supposedly mummified non-human remains from Peru.
What can I say? I mean, you'd think that the government of Mexico would take this stuff really seriously and look into what's going on versus being surprised.
Well, the narrative is by people like Mawson that it's going to be the Mexican government who first recognized this stuff. But when they, without being offensive, when the evidence which is presented front and center looks like 2 crummy paper mache'd like little dummies that don't resemble anything you'd think of has ever actually lived and walked around, unless maybe a 10-year-old made it. it's pretty difficult to take it seriously. And of course, already various news services, like I noticed the AP were talking about it, and Wired were talking about it, and the Guardian were talking about it, and mentioning a couple of things. One, of course, Mawson had presented these Peruvian dummies, or or I should say Peruvian non-human mummies, right? Because that's what he's terming them, had presented something similar back in 2017, which people are suggesting is probably the same thing. People who've examined it are suggesting that inside it's just a combination of weird animal bones, because they've got X-ray photos as well and other things. And outside it's just essentially a paper mache material holding it all together.
Yeah.
And I mean, literally, I've made dead aliens for a Roswell party I held in 1997 when I was in college for the 50th anniversary. And my brother and I and my girlfriend at the time all made paper mache gray extraterrestrials. And I'll tell you what, I would have been less embarrassed rolling them out for Congress than I would have been rolling these things out.
I mean, is this a circus? I mean, to me, you muted yourself, by the way. To me, it should be taken seriously. Again, the question becomes to me, is you think the Congress of the country of Mexico would say, hey, buddy, we can't have this stuff. Go away.
Well, I wonder how much of it was showed beforehand, and how much. I mean, Jamie Mawson, that people might know. There's a couple of documentaries about him actually on Amazon Prime, which are free. They're probably on Tubi and other sites as well. But he was a fairly well-known journalist who got into UFO investigation, and then he had a very successful show in Mexico about the unexplained, which I think had something like 2 million viewers, which is pretty significant. So in Mexico, he's probably well known. I guess he'd be similar to our George Knapp, who, of course, while not being interviewed at the UFO congressional hearings here a couple of months ago, was front and center behind the witnesses, and his statement was read into the congressional record. So in many ways, I suppose he's thought of as a respectable journalist in Mexico, even though previously he's been front and center of presenting other things, which in the past have been totally discredited. And I think I've got a couple of photos here. There was a little creature called, if I can find the thing, there was a creature called here it is, the Melapec creature.
Yeah.
There it is. And apparently it turned out to be some shaved monkey that somebody had taxidermied. He was behind a similar demon fairy thing that had been presented in the past. And I think some other mummified remains as well, like I mentioned previously in Peru. So he has presented previous supposedly examples of dead humanoid, non-human, extraterrestrial, alien life, whatever we want to call it, and it's been blown out of the water in the past. And here he is front and center at that country's UFO congressional hearing, being clearly the key witness, or the key presentation, certainly the one that obviously the press was going to pay the most attention to. Because it's also worth mentioning that the Mexican government obviously flew in Ryan Graves, who's the Navy pilot and also the head of Americans for Safe Aerospace, that anybody who's been following the Tic Tac story and the story about the Pentagon having UFO programs here and everything since it broke in 2017 in the New York Times have seen that man interviewed on every news show, and he was rolled out at our congressional hearings as well. So he's a very well-known and what seems to be a reliable witness, at least about UFOs seen in the sky. So it's like they did bring in experts or witnesses from all around the world, but it was Jamie Mawson, their own, I suppose, UFO star, that rolled out the evidence, which everyone's going to focus on talking about this hearing.
Well, it was at the point. Was the setup? Was it purposely set up to say, here's a shiny, pay attention to this?
I mean, that's a good point. Is it just so? I think if I was somebody who believed in the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and people who listen to this show regularly know I take the UFO phenomenon very seriously. I spend an awful lot of time academically studying UFO belief, and I think there is a phenomenon, at least to some, at the heart of some of this. I'm just reluctant to accept the type of nuts and bolts stories which talk about dead alien bodies being recovered, because they always end up in some ridiculous dead end or hoax like this. But that's another aside. But I think if I was somebody who believed in the ETH and thought there was a government conspiracy to cover up the recovery of dead extraterrestrials and downed nuts and bolts spacecraft from off-world, I think I would be looking at this and going, this has got to be some kind of con just to make everybody who thinks what I think look
Right.
bad.
Right. Make them look like fools.
Yeah, because how can you present this and be taken seriously? And we know it's all going to fall apart, just like Melson's other presentations of previously, supposed alien bodies.
Well, even other Mexicans reported well-known scientists that said this is fake. They said there's nothing to do with it. So here again, I asked the question, why wouldn't they do this for? It makes no sense unless they want to make the whole idea look stupid. No, that makes perfect sense.
I think there is a part of the audience. Like, I was amazed when I was watching in prep for this show a number of different channels, news clips, where they just have a 5-minute overview, fairly crummily put together, particularly ones pushed out on UFO channels. How many people were looking at this as some kind of legitimate evidence? I mean, maybe they don't know the history of Mawson's other disclosures, which haven't ended well. Maybe they're so eager to have a dead extraterrestrial on their hands that they'll accept anything. Maybe because it's a government seeming to put this forward as evidence at a hearing, they're more accepting of it. But I tend to place a lot of this thing, as I always do on this show and on Mysterious Library. And on Mysterious Library this week, we'll be looking at some of the documentaries about Jamie Mawson as well, and talking about his involvement in this story and in others. So people should tune in 9 p.m. Central and listen to Jason McLean and I dissect the Mawson story a little bit more. But there's a long history in UFO belief, of course, of aliens or alien artifacts being recovered. So this feeds into a belief system which already exists. If you look at the history of ufology, there have been since, well, you can say even before the modern period. So let's say the modern period starts in 1947 with Kenneth Arnold's sighting. There's reports about the Great Airship in 1897, which flew over America, which when people got interested in UFOs and went and looked at that flap, because Charles Ford had written about it previously. So people went and pulled all the old newspaper stories, and they found things like the Aurora crash in Texas in 1897, where supposedly the airship crashed and a dead non-human pilot was buried in Aurora's graveyard. And there's been attempts over the years to unearth that pilot and everything. The reality is it was probably a tall tale, much like other tall tales that yellow journalism was responsible for in the late 19th century, when editors ran ridiculous stories to sell papers, which were, crazy stories like burying dead airship pilots, right? But then if you come to the modern period, in the 1950s, one of the first UFO journalists here, or one of the first journalists who became popular with UFO readers here, Frank Scully, wrote a number of articles, and then he wrote one of the first flying saucer books, which introduced what was called the Aztec, New Mexico UFO crash. So while in 1947 there was that story about the Army airfield in Roswell capturing a downed flying saucer, that was dismissed the next day, and the UFO community didn't take it seriously at all. Certainly in 1947, nobody was talking about alien bodies being discovered at Roswell. That didn't become well known until the late 70s and the 80s in ufology. Everybody ignored that story for over 30 years. But the Aztec crash, which Frank Scully popularized, talked about a crash in 1948 in Aztec, New Mexico, where alien bodies were recovered. And that became part of UFO mythology, even though it was dismissed and it turned out the two guys who told Scully the story were con men. The idea of alien sources and alien bodies being recovered became part of UFO law in the United States of America. The idea that there were bodies at Wright-Patterson airfield in a secret hangar 18 that people had seen. And then later on, when Roswell was repopularized in the 1980s, people came out with their own supposed remembrances of people telling them about seeing bodies at Roswell. For example, Glenn Dennis, the mortician, who's one of the most famous witnesses of the Roswell event, supposedly talked to a nurse who told him that she'd seen these bodies autopsied and drew him a sketch. And then later, Dennis paid an artist that he told him, do a good job, this will make us a lot of money, when Roswell was repopularized in the 90s, to draw a sketch of the bodies. Now, the name of the nurse changed in the tellings of Glenn Dennis's story. I met Dennis as well before he died. I like Glenn Dennis. I interviewed him, but certainly even a lot of people in ufology began to doubt the Glenn Dennis nurse story. And that's where we get an awful lot of the body mythology of Roswell, which just seemed to build on earlier stories. For example, the Aztec crash. So I'm not sure if this is something you've butted into when I know you've written extensively about UFOs in a number of places, particularly your UFO Cults Watch the Skies book. So what's your kind of take on the whole, other than me just ranting about this all day as I could, what's your whole take on the recovered alien
My
thing?
whole take is this. We know that since 1947, the government has lied. The government has lied to us repeatedly. And again, it doesn't make any sense. Why would they lie? Why would they lie to the degree that they have? Why spend all the money that they've spent? Or someone spent a lot of money. It may not be the government, but someone spent a lot of money, a lot of time to basically make UFO people look nuts. And sometimes they don't need a lot of help to do it. And sometimes they do. And sometimes they go out of their way to make some of the nicest people in the world sound absolutely batshit crazy. And there's no reason why that makes any sense to me, but they're doing it for a reason.
Yeah, I like your take on it because we have a slightly different approach. Are there things that are there reports you've heard, or are there things that you've seen which make you sympathetic to the idea of there being a particular artifact or a particular case which might make you lean more towards? Is there a story out there you particularly like about
The
this
only
type of
thing I
stuff?
think might have happened, in my opinion, I do not think they recovered any bodies. I don't think they recovered any material. I don't think either one has happened. I don't think they shot anything down. I don't think that's happened either. I do think there's evidence, photographs, video, witnesses that more than we know about that might make sense. And again, they're hiding it for a reason. What might that reason be?
Well, that's
Because
interesting. Emily Menshouse from What the Frick Live, I've been on her show and she's been on Talking Weird. Thanks so much for listening, Emily. She says something similar to what you just did. They did it for a distraction. The CIA, FBI, governments always use aliens and UFOs to distract us from what is really going on in the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting how they use circus tricks, right? BT Bottom. Let's do something crazy. Let's do something weird. Let's entertain the masses. Let's give them bread and circuses.
I think there's probably been an awful lot of that with repopularization of UFOs since 2017 when the New York Times broke that story. I've long suspected that there's an intentional release. Now, I'm not sure if it is just for a distraction. I'm not sure if maybe it's to prepare us for not real disclosure, but to point us in a certain direction, to point our beliefs in a certain direction, to engineer perhaps some social expectations, the way Jacques Vallée suggested the UFO phenomenon might be used. And of course, Jacques Vallée used to talk much the way that I'm talking now, but Vallée himself wrote a book not that long ago called Trinity, the Best Kept Secret, which was about another supposed UFO crash in 1945, where alien bodies and debris were also recovered. So even Jacques Vallée, who had long been skeptical of these tales of recovered sources and recovered little green or little gray men or whatever color they might be, depending on the decade, he himself now subscribes to the idea that the US government has metamaterials and biological life, just like we're hearing from Grush, the whistleblower, these days.
Well, how hard is it for the government to keep that a secret? With all the people that have to suppress, all the people that have to keep silent, how hard is that to do? We're not talking one or two people have to keep quiet. We're talking by now hundreds. How do you keep them silent? You can't kill them because that raises suspicions.
I mean, there's certainly talk, of course, about some people being killed for this knowledge.
Yeah.
We did, I shouldn't chuckle because it's actually tragic, but we did a documentary called The Underground on Mysterious Library. We looked at one, and that talks about a UFO researcher who was doing the circuit in the 1990s, popularizing the idea of an extraterrestrial base under the Dulce Mesa. And he died in rather strange and unfortunate circumstances. There's other cases of other people who've talked about these type of things, Jim Keith, but Jim Keith talked about all kinds of weirdness as well, dying mysteriously after a rather minor accident at Burning Man. And the tales go on and on. William Cooper, of course, actually died in a gun battle, but he had all kinds of other conspiratorial ideas and other things that he was involved in. So there is a history sometimes of perhaps these people being knocked off. And I'm playing devil's advocate now. Like,
no. I think you're right. I think that in my opinion, again, my opinion only. I'm not that case here in Wisconsin. It's like you, sir. Something's going on. It doesn't. when you have a government that's now suspected of suppressing information because that's against what they want us to believe, where does that end? If you can't trust the government to tell you the truth, what then do you believe?
I think that, yeah, that's part of it too. I think there's a general, well, it goes both ways, because I think people are prepared to accept a lot of these type of stories because there's been cracks in the political consensus since the 1960s in America. Today, we really see them. There's almost no political consensus anymore. But from about the time of the Kennedy assassination and through the Vietnam era onwards, up to Watergate, there began to be a shattering of any sense that you could trust your government. And America was based on the idea that the government was of and by and for the people. But when you, from Kennedy onwards, there seems to be doubt in that. And I would suggest
Oh,
that,
you don't have to. You can go further back than
oh
Kennedy.
yeah, you could go to not. I agree. I was actually just quick, and then I'll stop and let you talk. But I think in 1947, when the National Security Act is first signed, I don't know if Americans were conscious of it then, but it closed a lot of what used to be an open society. And you can probably go even further back. So yeah, tell me what you were going to say before I cut you off. Sorry.
We can go back to the 30s, the 40s, when we had Mussolini had the mafia kill a reporter who was writing anti-Italian fascist stories. We have in the 50s, we had people kidnapped off the streets and sent to the Dominican Republic because they're writing negative stories about the then dictator to be tortured horribly. I mean, we can go back throughout time. The idea is, now that you said yourself, sir, that people asking questions, we now have the ability to communicate quickly and rapidly. That can't be stopped. The problem is, you remember John Keel writes about this, I believe, and he says that one guy will write a book about Atlantis, and then for whatever reason, someone else will write a book about Atlantis, use the first guy's book, then someone else down the line will then look at those two books and come up with his own thing, and soon it gets, my favorite word, batshit crazy. Where does it start? How can that be directed? Can you, in fact, I'm sorry, I'm talking too fast. I apologize.
No, that's good, man.
Can you, in fact, create a mythos where you encourage people to take a point of view? You know, you build on that mythos until you create something that you can think you can control until it blows up in your face, such as paper mache dummies.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about, Keel, is particularly relevant to us talking about this growing mythology of dead alien bodies, because the stories build on each other and each other and each other. So eventually what happens is people look back at the Aurora crash and the Aztec story, and all of this is somehow proof of things that happened later. Oh, we've had aliens before. So, but they're not conscious that they're just feeding into a growing mythology. Instead, those things are cited as some type of historical proof, when
Right.
all to me it indicates is a type of legend cycle being kicked off and continuing to roll. It's not like anybody ever dug up that alien at Aurora, and it's not like Aztec proved out to be true. I mean, it was pretty much dismissed as a hoax literally, over half a century ago. But this stuff is still picked up by believers as footnotes to add to the story. And I think there's something. I know you go. I'm sorry. I
It's
could
okay.
keep
I don't
ranting.
need
You
to.
go.
No, please.
No, I was just going to say, I think there's something terribly attractive when it comes to alien bodies about the idea of having that level of physical proof. I remember another very popular relic in the UFO community back in the 90s, and that was the Star Child skull that Lloyd Pye would take around and show at UFO conventions. I met Lloyd Pye. I spent some time with him at a conference in Clearwater when I was doing my PhD research. He was a very nice man. I got on with him very well, and he was certain that this skull, which had been discovered, I think, in some cave somewhere, and I don't know, I can't even remember if it was in America or if it was in the US or it was in Central America, but it was some native burial site, and there was the supposedly the body of a normal woman discovered, or the bones of a normal woman, along with this misshapen kind of child skull. And his suggestion, and of course the popular one in the UFO community, was that this was literally a star child, in other words,
Yeah.
an alien or an alien hybrid. And of course, I don't know if it's ever been totally dismissed, but certainly I heard everything from, people suggesting it was just some kind of deformity to some example of cradle boarding, because we know there were tribes in that time who used to do things to misshapen infants' heads, or it was a child who had some, serious, had both, maybe was already malformed when it was born, and then its deformities were added to. In any case, the desire for that star child skull to prove what everybody was talking about, ETs and ET hybrids, was very strong in the community. And incidentally, I think that star child skull probably was just some poor deformed child's remains.
I agree.
But that was a heck of a lot more convincing when you looked at it and held it. Well, I held a replica in my hand. Lloyd didn't travel with the original, but he traveled with a really, pretty stunning replica of it. That was far more convincing of something weird than these strange paper mache looking alien mummies, which just got rolled out at the Mexican, UFO congressional hearing.
I mean, it would be interesting to see where this takes us. I mean, will someone else come up with a piece of metal that's from a spaceship, or they claim it's a spaceship? We won't know until it happens, and something more will come up, without a doubt, because the mythology must be continued. I mean, even if it's spread in circuses, the myth has to be built upon.
Yeah, Emily made another good point. She said they give us what the CIA calls limited hangouts, some very little truth followed up with lies, but enough truth to keep us hanging on. I think all disinformation requires some level of truth to it. And I suspect that there probably have been secret projects. There probably still are secret projects, which it's very convenient to hide with stories of extraterrestrials and alien technology. In fact, we know that the CIA in the I think the 50s into the 60s, were very happy to spin the UFO story as a cover for things like test flights of US planes, because if somebody sees something weird, it's better they come out and say it's a flying saucer to the press than they saw, the U2 or something before it's been disclosed.
Absolutely.
So I think that doesn't even have to go down a sinister conspiratorial path to think, well, it makes sense to use some of this stuff as spin. And I wonder, with the Tic Tac videos and these type of UFOs, if this isn't just some advanced US technology. So they roll out a Navy pilot who obviously isn't going to be read into what's being tested by Skunk Works or Dreamland or wherever the devil this stuff's tested, this next generation or, third forward generation technology, which we're not going to see for decades and decades, if ever. And then they say, well, I've never seen anything like that. And so your average member of the American public goes, well, this Navy pilot would know if we had it or not. Because they always ask those Navy pilots, is this like anything you've ever seen? Doesn't matter who it is, it's CNN, if it's Tucker Carlson, whoever's interviewing them. Is this like anything you've ever seen before? No, this is nothing like we've got. This is decades ahead of what we've got, but we're already testing things which are decades ahead of what we have. That's the reality.
We've done it before. Look at well, that's not quite UFOs, but it's technology that we supposedly didn't have, but it seems that we do, is remote viewing. There's something to remote viewing. We know that now. They spent a lot of money, a lot of resources experimenting with remote viewing. There's something to it. What? Nobody really knows. At least I don't. But I'm sure they're still doing it. Same thing with UFOs. Is they use those ideas that a mythology has been built on to manipulate our thoughts, to do whatever they want to do with it.
Well, I think in a way it's already been so influential on just the way we view all kinds of things. UFO belief, even if you're not an avid UFO believer, impacts almost everybody today. It's become such a part of our culture, the idea that there are spacefaring civilizations and we've probably been visited or will be visited or are visited, or if you see a strange light in the sky, it mightn't be ours. I think it's gone beyond just a very small believer subset, which it might have been originally back in the very early days, to so culturally prominent now that ideas that once were just, in the domain of science fiction magazines and UFO authors has now entered the popular consciousness more than ever, particularly with the New York Times story in 2017 going forward, because then you got the mainstream media taking this seriously in America for the first time since literally probably 1969, when the Condon Committee said the the University of Colorado's UFO study, which was hired by the Air Force to determine once and for all if the US government should be investigating this. When the Condon Committee said there's nothing here in 69, pretty much going forward, it wasn't that there was never any paranormal shows about UFOs on TV, or that there was never a story about a UFO sighting, but it was never taken so seriously by the mainstream media that it would be an ongoing story that kept popping up on everything from Fox News to CNN to the New York Times. But it's re-entered the popular consciousness. So I think now almost everybody is on board this idea that we're being visited.
Well, remember the TV show The Invaders?
Was it The Invaders? Yeah, where there was the architect trying to stop the plan.
Right. I mean, that was kind of a silly, laughy, laugh as a funny TV show. It's kind of cool science fiction. Then we had UFO, which was a show from England. And now we have the X-Files, and we have Fringe, right? No, it took one to go to the other one, because the X-Files would never have lasted in fish. It never would have happened, right? But you had that build on the same idea of building on mythology. The mythology has to be built on, in order to do the TV shows. Now, my question is this: where it was advertising agencies hired to come up with a long-term idea for a myth to build on the popular consciousness, and build TV shows on top of that to drive it.
Well, I think the X-Files, and it's a wonderful show. I mean, it's probably one of my favorite TV shows of all time, just because it's such an entertaining show, and because Duchovny and Anderson have great chemistry, and it's written well, and it's clever, and yada yada yada. But I think that introduced so many of these concepts, which were even more kooky and out there, into the broad popular consciousness. Like, anybody who listens regularly here will often hear me refer to modern UFO belief as X-Files UFO belief, because everybody knows what that means. It means government cover-ups and, alien abductions and secret underground bases. And that isn't what UFO believers always necessarily thought the phenomenon was like. When people were writing about government cover-ups the way Donald Kehoe was, the head of NICAP, the ex-Marine major in the 1950s through the 60s. When he was writing his books about an Air Force cover-up, it was always kind of, benign. It just was kind of, he thought, well, I know they're keeping the secrets for national security, but they should tell us some of the stuff. It was never the idea that there was some kind of ongoing conspiracy between aliens and the US government that let the aliens abduct people, and that they were, doing reverse engineering of source of technology in Area 51. It was a very different idea.
And speaking of abduction, right? Why have they abducting Americans, Europeans, when there's all kinds of people in South America, all kinds of people in Africa that can abduct all day, all night, and nobody ever miss? No, but let's abduct these two people driving down the street and keep them and torture them, do other things for them, right? So they go on TV and talk about it.
Well, yeah, see, I think you're suggesting what's called the MILAB theory, that there's military abductions, or there's actually intelligence agencies doing these abductions. Is that what you might be suggesting? Or
no, I'm suggesting that if the UFO people were actually here abducting people, why would they abduct people who have the ability, if they let them, if they lived, right, would go to the media, go to the police, and cause that stir, when they could abduct somebody from Africa that nobody ever missed? So if they did get away somehow, who are they going to tell?
Well, I think the growth in alien abduction alone, or the way it grew, is interesting, that it becomes, at least in its presentation, very almost homogenized. So all the aliens are gray extraterrestrials. There's an expectation about what they do when they abduct you. There's, these limited windows of missing time. There's the idea that it's generational. These ideas didn't belong in the UFO literature well into the 70s. I mean, you didn't have the first abduction seriously talked about was Villa Boas, which is, I think, Brazil abduction, which happened even prior to the Betty and Barney Hill. And that started getting introduced into some of the more serious UFO literature. probably in the 60s. And then the Betty and Barney Hill story, which was covered originally in the book The Interrupted Journey, started to introduce aspects of what became the gray extraterrestrial abduction kind of
But
version.
you didn't
But it
even-
wasn't exactly the same. It took a while to build that mythology. Like stories, as you were talking before, like the Keel thing, stories had to build on stories, and researchers had to channel the stories to fit this narrative, and different researchers channeled them different ways. So you had people like John Mack from Harvard, where his abductees were having more pleasant experiences, which seemed to be sometimes spiritually enlightening. And then you had people like David Jacobs and Bud Hopkins, and the people that they were working with, their abductions seemed to be nastier and to suggest some kind of plan of planetary conquest through their breeding program with humans. So it's interesting to see the cultural forces and individuals who shaped what people
And
believe
if I'm
today.
not mistaken, didn't the Hills first describe the aliens not as grays but as Nazis?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a number of in the Interrupted Journey when they're actually when the author is presenting the actual hypnosis sessions by, I think Benjamin Simon was the psychiatrist who abducted them, and he incidentally didn't think they'd had an experience that they were abducted by aliens. He thought it was some more complex psychological experience. But they describe them in different ways as they're kind of remembering and trying to put together this story. So Barney describes them as red-headed Irishmen at one point. At another point, he describes them as Nazis. They're wearing Nazi uniforms. I often get it wrong. I think Betty Hill describes them as having big noses like Jimmy Durante at one stage. At another stage, she suggests they look like the Mongoloid children because apparently she was a social worker. And I don't even know if Mongoloid's a politically correct term anymore, but I think that's the term she used. So she looked like disadvantaged or, children that she'd worked with who had that kind of, disability. So it's interesting that these different it's almost like a dream state. They're capturing these different ideas. And then eventually you get something. If you look at the Interrupted Journey TV movie, you start to see these things which are beginning to look like the gray extraterrestrials. In fact, I think they have biggish eye holes, and I think that might have had something to do with the later idea of them having big eyes, because I think for the actors, they probably needed bigger eye holes for them to see out of the masks. That's just a theory I threw out there. But Martin Kottmeyer has done an excellent work on how the idea of the aliens being gray kind of developed. And it's a complicated kind of process. And it's very easy, as I often have, just to be, to quickly do a rundown of it. But people who want to look into the development of why we see aliens the way we do today, it didn't just happen overnight. You can trace this cultural and social development. If you look at the UFO reports from the 1940s through to the 60s, the type of creatures people were encountering, they were all different shapes and sizes. They weren't this homogeneous little grey ET, which has been popularized in modern culture and in abduction law. There was all kinds of things.
I wonder if Disney got the contract back in the day to create a mythos. And that contract's been followed ever since.
See, that's where you go further down the rabbit hole. I mean, there's certainly people who I think suggest that. Again, like I said, I think this story can be used to benefit people. Rick Doty, who was behind or part of the psyop performed on Paul Benowitz, which is a long story too far to go into. He says that, or has said, including on Talking Weird, but I think he said it when he was interviewed by Stephen Greer as well, that he knows of Air Force programs which faked alien abductions by actually having people that had deformities and things, and I guess they were helped more with additional prosthetics or something, I can't even remember now, go in and abduct people. But he said it wasn't to convince these people of alien abductions. It was because you might be able to put the frighteners on somebody or get more information out of them if they thought it was ETs coming to them in the middle of the night than if it was just, I don't know, a couple of government agents come to rough them up.
That'd be fascinating because we know that the CIA did many things such as MK Ultra to try to control people's minds, right? Wouldn't it be cool if they could control people's thoughts and using mythology to create a universe where ET wanted you to do something, wanted you to act to something, wanted you to believe something? And how much greater it would be If it wasn't the government that wanted you to do this or that other thing, but ET wanted you to be a better person.
Well, in a way that becomes almost the same way that religion has been used to direct social norms for good and for bad, throughout history. I think there are clear examples of when somebody thinks there's a higher moral code just above themselves, that they behave better than they might if they think it's an entire free for all. But there are certainly also examples where religion has been used to control people to be subservient to authoritarian
Yeah,
regimes. And so perhaps you're right. Perhaps the development of extraterrestrial belief can be manipulated or might one day be used
yeah, I'd be interested to do a Freedom
for
of
something
Information
similar.
Act request on that subject
Yeah,
because I wonder what you find out.
I wonder how I think it would probably be a question of how you would phrase it as well. Like, it's a complicated one to phrase
It
in
would be,
a
but it'd be
request.
interesting to experiment. I mean, as you well know, I like going down those rabbit holes. It'd be interesting to see. It's only what it's a lot of takes a couple. You think about it for a while, you rewrite it a couple of times, and see what happens. I mean, the guy that does the website, the Black Vault, has that kind all kinds of interesting information and all kinds of fascinating subjects by asking for Freedom of Information Act requests. And I think it's worthwhile at the time. I do.
Maybe send him a message because he probably knows how to word those requests to get the type of information that he's looking for. I've heard, and I've never tried to do a Freedom of Information Act request myself, but I've heard it's very dependent upon what you put within your terminology and your request parameters as far as the
More
success
than
of what
part,
you
we
get
did
back.
one for my book on Frank, the mafia guy in Milwaukee. It was pretty easy. What information do then what did you have for the FBI had? We got his case file, and he was dead. So it was not a problem. Because they don't know one cares about Frank. I mean, the same thing about Jimmy Hoffa. You get a lot of blank pieces of paper.
Nancy Malcolm has a question. I think it's for you, Wayne. Why are the popular theories? Why are the popular theories now the ones that throw cryptids, ETs, ghosts, ancient gods, etc., all into a collective group out to kill or enslave humans? What advantage does this theory present?
Fear. Fear. It needs one fear. Fear of the known. Mind you, if I was walking on my street and walking down my yard with my dogs, and I saw something with 15 arms show up, the government would have not tell me to be scared. I'd be pretty scared to begin with, right? Somebody else show up here wanting me wearing a dark suit, wearing a nice tie, and said, God, they need to get a drink of water because I need a pill to take. I'd be cautious because I'd be John Keel too, right? I've heard bump beeps and buzzes my phone. I'd be careful too because again, I read John Keel too, right? But they want me, in my opinion, I think the government wants us to be scared. The government needs fear, in my opinion.
Yeah, Nancy agreed with you. She said, Wayne, I agree. Fear and confusion. It's interesting. I don't agree with all of what Stephen Greer has to say. I agree with his suggestion that we have an awful lot of this technology and we developed a lot of it and we kind of pretend it's ET. But Greer goes to the next level to say there really are ETs out there. And he suggests something similar in that much of the type of stories that Nancy was talking about, which is spun around evil ETs and other things, is to create this state of fear. So they can one day come out and say, well, we have to have a war with the space people to justify their black budgets and to justify
Yeah.
everything that they've done. And I don't know if I agree with that final part in the theory, but maybe you don't even need the aliens to be real to justify the budgets eventually. If you have
No,
enough people thinking the aliens are real, then that alone might say, well, this is why we had to keep our technology secret from you. This is
right,
why we
because
have
we
to
had to
spend so
protect
much
you
money on Space
from them.
Force.
We can't tell you about these things. It's interesting too that when I read about what we can do with the Voyager spacecraft, right, that we launched years ago, billions of miles away, and we communicate with a modem at 256 baud rate, right? What can we do now? It's incredible what we can do now. And that gets me excited. It gets me to want to work together with the people, do the science that makes these things possible. So get me on board in these things, ideas that make us a stronger as a country to do things together versus we have to be scared.
Well, I think, yeah, as we were talking about earlier, I think we live in a time where there is particular division, and I'm not sure. Maybe the belief in evil ETs would bring everybody together. That's what Reagan used to talk about. Remember, he on a number of speeches said that maybe we'd forget all our differences on this planet if all of a sudden we were presented with an extraterrestrial threat. And that's been a darling of science fiction as well. I think it was presented in an Outer Limits episode. The original Watchmen comic book had that idea. It's appeared a number of times. So maybe it could be used. The social controllers, if they are out there, think they can use it in a way to bring us together one day. Who knows? Emily has a question for you, Wayne. I don't know if you know what Project Bluebeam is, but she says, does he believe that this has to do with Project Bluebeam?
I'm unfamiliar with Project Bluebeam. Bluebeam, whatever. Sorry.
That's so good, man. And I think there's, is this a, no, this is just a comment from somebody else. A WEF wants division. Well, I think a lot of people benefit from division. I think if you, I don't want to go down a conspiratorial kind of rabbit hole, but I think if you have people obviously who are more concerned about certain cultural and social issues, they might ignore who actually, the big boss men are, who are controlling the planet and controlling the finances and doing everything else. I think potentially the UFO thing could be similarly used. I think if you have people focused on a threat or something that mightn't even exist, then perhaps they mightn't look where the threat really is. So this could be used in so many ways. I don't have a firm theory of how these type of things are actually designed to be used or how they are used, whether they're designed to be used or not. But I'm fairly confident that it's been plenty of times intelligence agencies and think tanks have, kind of role played or, gamed out how they can use the ET invasion scenarios or the belief in ETs to, get certain things done.
Have you remember the movie called The Colossus Project?
No, tell me about it. I don't know if I've ever seen it.
It's about a giant supercomputer that was designed to run everything. And what it did was, as soon as it got control of everything, it took control, right? And then, of course, that was the first book. And the second book was people figured a way to beat the computer. And the reason then in the second book we discovered was why the computer took over the world was to protect us from the aliens. And so the third book was getting the computer back online so good to protect us from the aliens, right?
Huh.
So the idea here is maybe the government does know there's a threat coming, and they have to figure out a way to make us believe there's a threat. But then again, if we don't trust the government, tell us the truth.
Well, I think that's the dilemma for the UFO community. The dilemma that I see for the UFO community that is very rarely recognized by believers in traditional extraterrestrial hypothesis, nuts and bolts UFO belief, is that if you haven't trusted the government ever since the modern UFO era started, post-World War II, if you think they've been lying to you and hiding things from you and doing all kinds of everything from weird, evil alliances with various ET groups on down, if you believe all of this, that means obviously you don't trust the government, right? Why will you all of a sudden trust the government if they deliver disclosure to you? Is it just because they tell you finally what you want to believe? That's a weird place to be in. You know what I mean? That you want disclosure. You want the government to tell you so much that what you believe is true. But for the last, 80 years, you haven't believed a word they've said as a community. So, it's to me, it's a dilemma which isn't really easily solvable. And I think, to be honest, it's ignored by the UFO community. Because they keep wanting disclosure, right? They keep wanting the government to tell them that we've got the sources, we've got the little green man, we've been involved in it all along, we've known about Roswell, da-da-da-da-da. But your whole belief system is based on the premise that the government has been lying to you about this stuff forever.
I mean, we got people that still don't believe landing on the moon. They think that movie, that director, Kubrick, right? Did it on the sound stage, even though that's totally not real. We actually did land on the moon. That we got reasonable people that believe we did not land on the moon. We got, and they'll never be convinced we did land on the moon.
Well, again, that's part of that kind of cultural crisis I was talking about before, where you have, and you see, again, I think it was the Condon Committee which really kicked it off it kind of accelerated it for ufology. People didn't already trust the government when there was finally a supposedly non-biased academic program say there's nothing here, the government are right, you don't have to look at it. I think the UFO community then started to spiral more into abduction tales, more into conspiratorial tales. And the other aspect of ufology, which we've talked about, John Keel and Jacques Vallée, and there were various people like that, Brad Steiger, etc., went off in another direction where they started to look at non-ET alternatives, more occult alternatives. It's interesting that Jacques Vallée wrote his groundbreaking book, Passport to Magonia, in many ways in response to the Condon Committee, where he started to think that UFOs had more to do with fairy faith than with occult traditions, because he thought science had failed him, because the Condon Committee had failed in many ways ufology. So at that stage, the government have failed you if you're a UFO believer. Science has failed you if you're a UFO believer. So what are your alternatives? You just have to go into various either esoteric occultic rabbit holes and throw science overboard altogether, or you have to presume that there's a massive conspiracy by people in power from scientific institutions throughout the intelligence organizations of the American government who are keeping the truth from you.
Yeah.
So
You know,
the consensus cracks. You don't trust the system anymore, and then anything can develop in that kind of environment.
which is the problem, because we need to be able to trust the government. We need to be able to tell when the government says something, we have to be able to a degree believe them. And we can't believe the government, then they lose the ability to, rule with the will of the people.
What do you expect, Wayne? Because I know you've been researching this stuff for ages. We've just seen this, we saw the US congressional hearing 2 months ago, which had all kinds of, kind of claims and innuendos by the whistleblower there, David Grush, and he did other interviews talking about countries all around the world having down sources and, the bodies of non-human entities. We have now the Mexican government kind of following that direction, and their star witness, Jamie Mawson, rolling out these, to me, something that looked like paper mache and poorly done paper mache extraterrestrials.
Yes.
And do you think there's going to be more of these kind of weird revelations, or what do you think?
I think we'll see a wide variety of revelations. I think we'll see both people coming out saying, I'm a good scientist and have good documentation, in nut cases. And I think the nut cases will get more of the media attention because it's easier to get the focus for the media on the nut case than it is to say some scientist that goes, I've done this research, I've done this other thing, this is what I've come up with, versus some guy saying, well, my Uncle Henry was actually a reptile from space, and this is what he told me, and here's my spaceship that nobody can see other than me. That's the easiest thing to done. That goes on all the time. I spend a lot of time on my Twitter account, which is Clingman Doctor on Twitter, and I listen to people, good, honestly, or people try to do the best job they know how, and they talk like they're batshit crazy. But they're doing it out of the goodness of the heart. They're doing it because they believe. They're not trying to hurt anybody. They're trying to have conversations with people to try to get themselves more involved, try to get themselves moving ahead further in what might be going on, so they can share what they know with other people and maybe share back and forth information. Absolutely support that 100,000%.
I think one of the dangers is too, with people who are presenting UFO information, is it's not always information. It's almost like infotainment. You know what I mean? It's what is the clickbait? What's the story that someone's going to want to read about? And we see this, I think, even on people who are, posting on social, because it's, more interesting, but we certainly see it on paranormal type TV shows. And we're starting to even see it the way that the most sensational aspects of the Mexican UFO congressional hearings, obviously, what are you going to focus on if you're the press there? Weird little mummified, or more to the point, paper mache alien dummies, because it's going to get people clicking on it and wanting to see, what's this? There's a dead alien? That's more so in a way, the space lends itself to infotainment, because people are interested in UFOs, even if no matter how high-minded or highbrowed they want to pretend they are. It's interesting because it's weird. It's strange. It's not
Yes,
it's
it's
not the same
entertainment.
as being entertained in, I don't know, the latest developments in, I don't know, some scientific or academic, study of the development of language or something like that.
I,
That might really be information, but this is crazy fun. There's weird little dead alien bodies and people saying Mussolini captured a flying saucer and all these stories. I mean, it's infotainment, and it mightn't even be info. It might be misinfotainment or disinfotainment.
I think if we had a lecture between SpaceX talking about their plans to go to the moon and more of this information entertainment, as you call it, I think that the latter would get more views. Even though SpaceX to me is more exciting, it's more something's going to happen. It's more relevant to American society and the world society as a whole. But God, look at these crazy people in Mexico and these paper mache dolls. We get the views.
And I mean, I'll be honest, I'm to a degree guilty of it myself. I want to talk about things on this show and on Mysterious Library, which are entertaining. There are probably aspects, if you really wanted to dig into it, which might be more academically or scientifically focused if you were talking about the weird, but it's not as interesting as talking about paper mache alien dummies presented to the UFO Congress in Mexico, or the Congress on the congressional study on UFOs in Mexico, or whatever the thing's called. Nancy Malcolm says science versus superstition, same old story. People believe things they have experienced or someone they know have experienced. Logic makes no difference. And that's probably a part of it as well. We're experiential creatures. If we have something weird happens to us, or our friend tells us something weird happened to them, yeah, we do pay attention.
Like life.
So where can people get a hold of you or see what you're up to anyway, mate?
All my books on Amazon, to include UFO Cults. I got 14 or 15 more. Everything running from the Mafia to crazy stuff in Hollywood, whole 9 yards. I'm easily gotten hold of by my Twitter, which is, of course, my Twitter would be, of course, Milwaukee Mob 2. Milwaukee Mob 2 on Twitter would find me on Twitter. My email, though, is kind of long. Maybe you could put something in the show notes and stuff so somebody would find me by my email to get a hold of me.
Sure.
That way I'm pretty easy to get a hold of by email.
Well, we've got your Amazon page in the show notes too, so people know, because your books are available. Is your film we played at Midwest Weird Fest a few years ago, the Frank Balistrieri one?
It's Amazon Prime.
Is that on Prime? Okay, well, people can probably check out that too if they go to
your page. You can watch it on YouTube for free.
Oh, well, that's good.
Yeah, absolutely. We have more stuff coming. We have working a documentary on the Vegas skim, knock on wood. And we have a couple more books coming out on the Vegas skim itself. Vegas skim is that's another huge rabbit hole. They can go down in a hurry, right?
Oh, I bet.
And even the whole idea about the Locus Bluff, which is a situation in Wisconsin, like the whole died, right? An old guy telling stories of his life. There's not much more to it than that, but there's so many interesting, fun stories about the mysteries of Wisconsin rivers. Everything from Locust Bluff on the Wisconsin River to the Aslan temples. Did they really find she shells as they claim to have found? And what's going on with all those strange deaths by drowning in lacrosse?
We should do a lacrosse show, talk about the smiley face killer stuff, which we were talking about before the show sometime. Especially when you're working on that book, which I think you are. Just speaking about the mafia and skims, and to feed it back into what we were talking about tonight before we go, is there any odds that you can place at the moment on the revelation of ET life or government disclosure? I'm sure some bookie must run something on it. I'm curious.
I expect they do in England, because you can bet anything in England. But offhand, I'll tell you what, I think there's probably good 20 to 1 odds for that more information will come out about something real about the aliens. It may turn out the long run to be bogus, but more information will come out about something, without a doubt, especially depending if we have a bad flu season or not. If we have a bad flu season, not so much.
We won't talk too much about that. I think
we won't.
Dangerous.
But if we have a light flu season, then we see more stuff happening with aliens.
Well, you never know. And also we have Ristol saying, great discussion tonight. Next time we didn't need to hear some more stories of your old haunted house. So maybe we need to talk about, because you've told me some weird stories about your place.
Well, but my wife's China camera being floated off the air was pretty weird. I mean, flying across the room was kind of scary.
Well, that's a story for another show we've got to do. But man, thank you so much. It was such a great joy to have you on. I always love talking to you. It's particularly fun to.
Thank you for the friends request, Emily. 2 thumbs up.
Oh, Emily's great. If anybody doesn't listen to What the Frick Live out there, they should definitely go and check Emily's show out, because it's awesome and it's one of my favorite shows to guest on. I always have such a great time when I'm there. But until I talk to you again, Wayne, and everybody else out there, keep it weird.
Peace out.